Hello again, everyone. This is Jeff Adler, back to continue my video series, Why I'm Right 2.0, based on the book I wrote now gosh, 7 years ago. It came out. It's been about 6 months or so since I did my last video. I've been hiding in my basement with Joe Biden. Nope, just kidding. Just trying to avoid the silly season that comes before every election season, and it's been pretty ugly on Facebook. I haven't been on Facebook in God knows how long. Avoid it like the plague. Of course, I'll post this to Facebook, but only because that's where some people I know are and whatnot. But yeah, not pretty out there, folks. Anyway, wanted to chime in simply because this is about a week or so before the election. Some of us have already voted, but for those who haven't, whether this sways anybody one way or the other, I doubt. I don't do this for them, for you. I do it for me. But if you get any benefit out of it, great. If you learn anything, great. Because this is basically the most important election of your lifetime. I don't exaggerate. And it's probably the most important election in 160 years. 160 years ago, Abraham Lincoln was given the anal exam by the Democrats. Much like today, a Republican that came out of basically nowhere to do battle with Democrats who had long-standing, been in power for 40 years, weren't willing to give it up, were lying, corrupt, cheating sons of guns, and had, pretty much done all they could to mess with the country. Perpetuating slavery, trying to add states to the roles of slave states, reneging on the Missouri Compromise, which caused the rise of the abolitionist movement, revolutions and skirmishes by and in the name of John Brown, and ultimately a Republican Party that put up its first candidate in Abraham Lincoln that said, enough's enough. An outsider that went to the swamp of D.C. and realized that 40 years of Democrats in the White House, Van Buren and Buchanan and all these other corrupt sons of guns were, they needed to go. These people were fighting as hard as they could for some of the most ugly things to be perpetuated in this country: slavery, and later, of course, Jim Crow and segregation. As I mentioned before, one Republican stood up as a senator, stood up in Congress in the late 1850s for an hour and a half, spoke against slavery, and was met in his office or somewhere later by a Democrat who beat him with a cane or a club and almost till he died for deigning to speak out against slavery. The Democrats were at large. They were in charge. They thought they could do nothing wrong. They thought they could get away with anything they wanted to and acted like it. And the Republicans said, enough. This crap's got to end. And if Abraham Lincoln's campaign, if his very existence, if his ultimate victory in the 1860 election for president meant that the secession would go through and the Civil War would begin, so be it. It was an idea whose time had come. And the Republicans were done. And does any of that sound familiar, folks? When Donald Trump came out of nowhere, not a politician, not really, came from other types of jobs to come in and be the guy to shake things up, and is met with some of the most vitriolic ugliness that has ever been seen against the president, while Lincoln was campaigning against Stephen A. Douglas, and after he became president, the Democrats issued forth the most vehement, vitriolic, hate-filled low blows against him, his family, every name you could be called under the book, in the book. The women blushed and fainted at some of the stuff that was being thrown hitherto and yon. And the Democrats are no different today with what they say and lie and make up about Donald Trump. And why do they do this? What is the reason for this? Why specifically these two guys? Well, because Lincoln was going to upset their slavery apple cart and put an end to it. And they knew it. And the power and the corruption, everything that went along with it, money was at stake. Democrats backed the slaves, Republicans backed the non-slave areas, states, whatnot. This was Civil War was as much about Democrat versus Republican as it was about, again, North versus South, or slave versus non-slave, or secession versus Union. It was every bit as much Democrat versus Republican, and the lines were drawn and polarized the country as much as you can possibly imagine, and I know you can imagine because we have the exact same thing today. We're polarized for much different things than then, but there is a common thing that is still polarizing us, and that has to do with black people. And I'll get to that. Today, Donald Trump is fighting the Democrats because they want to hold on to power. They are sick, they are sotted, they are drunk on it. And they've had it in municipalities, in cities, in certain states, in certain districts for 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years in some cases, like Chicago. The urban areas under their watch, certain groups, minorities under their care, supposed, has gone right into the toilet. And Donald Trump came in and said, I just saw 8 years of some of the worst governance in my lifetime. Enough is enough. And the slings and arrows are everywhere, from everywhere, even from his own, theoretically, from his own party. These so-called Republicans, these never-Trumpers, who at one time you could say were even conservative in a weird way, and had espoused the exact same things that Donald Trump not only says, but does. And now they hate him. Tells you all you need to know about these asswipes, and it tells you all you need to know about where they're coming from. It's about them and their establishment and their place in the government. And when they were marginalized by the Trump movement, which was cleaning out the swamp and the establishment, no matter what party you belong to, that was stepping on toes and fellow Republican toes. And all of a sudden you've got a bunch of Republicans, so-called. At one time you used to say, yeah, okay, this guy's got a point, this guy makes some sense, this guy, this, that, and the other. Now they're anti-Trump and actually supporting Joe Biden. Spite is a powerful thing, folks. They're doing it out of spite. That's one hell of a reason to ruin your country, because somebody made you feel all the bad feels. Wow. What else is common about 1860 and now? Let's talk about slavery. Well, some say, well, okay, yes, there was slavery back then, and apparently there was a war to stop it. But blacks aren't slaves anymore, so how can that have anything to do with today? Blacks aren't slaves anymore? You sure about that? I beg to differ. And I have differed about this very thing. Blacks are not slaves the same way, but they are being treated as if they were. Let me explain. If I haven't already explained this before, let me try again. because, like I said, the similarities are eerie. The Democrats from 1860 forward were the only people outside of a handful, and I mean like less than 10, because you can count on two hands, of Republicans who owned slaves. The rest were all Democrats. And I'll repeat this as well from past videos. Every single piece of legislation and law that was passed that had anything to do with Jim Crow or segregation or anti-lynching laws or banning black kids from going to school or working against civil rights, every single one, without exception, was created by a Democrat legislature, was enacted by a Democrat government, was enforced by a Democrat governor, without exception. When that gig was up, because of civil rights, segregation became, a thing of the past. In the 1960s, the Democrat Party had to change tactics. They didn't have slavery anymore. Now they didn't have segregation anymore, but they still needed, wanted, desired to keep the blacks in control on their plantation, whether it was a figurative one, a metaphoric one, or what have you. How do you do it? Well, you just lie. We're used to doing that. We lied about fascism being right-wing, and we had our buddies in the newspapers and the radio and later television and all over the place lie for us. We changed the textbooks in the 1940s to help perpetuate this lie. We had the people in academia perpetuate this lie. We got lots of friends, us Democrats, us happy-go-lucky progressives. Lots of friends in high places with big, fat, loud megaphones who can alter and manipulate the culture just enough so we can slide by and get away with stuff. Getting away with stuff. That's that should be the motto of the Democrat Party. Getting away with stuff for 180 years. And over the decades since fascism was destroyed or ended, the media, academia, Hollywood, all the megaphones have only gotten stronger. Once they realized they could manipulate culture enough to affect politics, remember, politics flows downstream from culture, they had the means to control the narrative. And controlling the narrative was everything. There was a time where newspapers might have had some yellow journalism, had some Democrats on the take, some editorialists who were willing to sacrifice truth for an agenda, but there was just as many, if not more, that would counteract that. And so their impact was minimalized. So too when radio began, interestingly enough, just as the end of the first wave of progressivism ended, they needed a voice, the Democrats and the progressives did in the 1920s, which was dominated, the roaring 20s, a great economic time. It was dominated and created, if the truth be told, by Republicans. They needed a voice, and radio was that voice. And so they infiltrated radio, and they made sure that some higher muckety-mucks had at least given the progressives a voice. Might have been subtle, might have been subliminal even, but they needed to have the access. And even if for nothing else, it would help them in the future, and it certainly did. They weren't necessarily the majority. They weren't necessarily overwhelming the airwaves with their propaganda, but they were there. They were in the newspapers and they were in the radio. And then, of course, later we had um, television, and they got in on that, and as much and Hollywood, and they got in on that, and they had the teachers unions that started up that were brand spanking new in the 50s, and the Department of Education as a tool to move that stuff forward, and they got in on that. They changed the textbooks slowly, bit by bit. Not everywhere, not all the time, not all at once, but little bit by little bit, baby step, baby step, baby step. And then you had a perfect storm. All this stuff was set up. 30s, 40s, and 50s. All this was set up and was just waiting for the spark, the thing, the accelerant, the thing to make it explode. Perfect storm across a crossroads in history, and that was the 1960s, where you had the largest and young, impressionable generation in American history, the baby boom generation, with a little help from the forgotten generation just before it. Who was ripe because of their circumstances for manipulation. The baby boom generation was the first generation following World War II. They were huge in number. And these children were raised differently than perhaps any other generation. As I have also mentioned in a previous video, they were basically spoiled, many of them. The rod was spared and the child was spoiled. Thank you, Dr. Spock. These spoiled, entitled children who had some sense that they were basically contemptuous of their parents' generation and all things that went before it. The wars that went on, the hate supposedly that they were fighting against, authority of every kind and measure, the man, police, their own parents. There was nothing. They were rebels without a clue. They were rebellious against everything. It was all up for grabs for them. It was all meant to be changed for the sake of change. They didn't care how, as long as it happened. They felt entitled to this change. They felt entitled to whatever benefits they could make from this change. And so you had this mentality. And then all of a sudden, the setup of the propaganda from the left and the progressives coming in and being established in all of the cultural hotspots, academia, media, radio, television, newspapers, Hollywood, unions, education, all set up right before the baby boomers came of age and started to go to school and started to learn the crap that was suddenly being foisted on them, subliminally, in minor ways, in undetectable ways, but all feeding the monster. Until by the 1960s, many of these children had become college age, young adults, and the beatniks became hippies. The hippies became flower children. The flower children became psychedelic drug users. And voila, the perfect storm exploded. And all these people fought against everything. The man, authority, their parents, cops, people in charge, government. Everything that happened before was thrown out along with the baby and the bathwater. In our next part, we'll talk about the results of this and how this has affected our election today. See you on part 2.